Well, I believe it's the case that people have said insightful things about Adorno's negative dialectics. As I read this book, I find the thought to be so incredibly ponderous and almost impossible to penetrate in places, because Adorno essentially writes in riddles. Many of his sentences have a riddle quality to them. You have to discern them as this complicated, multi-layered riddle. So we can only do our best in trying to draw out meaning from this text. On page 160, he says, "What is negated is negative until it has passed. This is the decisive break with Hegel. To use identity as a palliative for dialectical contradiction, for the expression of the insolubly non-identical, is to ignore what the contradiction means." It's interesting that in dialectical thinking, in mature thinking, we are supposed to realize that contradiction has value. It's not just a negative concept. Ignore what the contradiction means. Most thought cannot even get to the point where they can comprehend what a contradiction means. So in dialectical thought, in negative dialectical thinking, one is utilizing the category of contradiction as a positive category toward reality, as another conceptual tool to better grasp reality. Adorno says, the thesis that negation of a negation is something positive can only be upheld by one who presupposes positivity as all conceptuality from the beginning. From the beginning, one holds this notion or this assumption, this presupposition of positivity. Well, this is an interesting question as to whether or not thought begins in the positive with a positive presupposition, or whether thought begins with a negativity of presupposition. Now, dialectically speaking and dialectically thinking, it's more likely that thought begins with a contradictory notion where it contains both the unification of a positivity and a negativity. And that is, I think, is a more accurate understanding of the position of thought, because it explains why thought is able to oscillate between the positive and the negative. Adorno says the negation of negation would be another identity, a new delusion, a projection of consequential logic, and ultimately of the principle of subjectivity upon the absolute. This idea of the negation producing an identity, it's true that we are always making use of a notion of identity within the architecture of our thought. But the understanding that the product of the process of thought, of the negative process of thought, that this leads us to the formation of a new delusion is indeed an important insight. Because if we have a formula for thinking that goes through a negative process, and that negative process brings us out into a positivity, and we automatically assume that because we've gone through this negative process to arrive at a positivity, that we have therefore arrived at a higher form, we have a problem, because it could be the case that we have arrived at a new delusion. Negative dialectics is a philosophy of suspicion. It's always suspicious of the process of knowledge and of the formation of concepts. It's suspicious of concepts. And it's important. This is a high value to have. It's a good disposition as a thinker to have. Now, there is a limit to this, because the negation of the negation producing an identity that essentially produces another delusion. And Hegel, I should say about Hegel that his philosophy is a circle that keeps on repeating. So the idea that we get to another position of identity through dialectical negation, and that this position of identity is somehow final, would be false in Hegel. Hegel would always remain open to looking into any conceptual form. The conceptual forms that Hegel is dealing with in dialectical thinking, those are forms that have gone through some type of process already. But the suspicion still remains within Hegel's philosophy as well. But there's something to be said here about this critique of a new delusion. This critique is not as powerful or important as we think it is. It matters because we're trying to be on our guard against deception. So if we are aware that the negation of the negation produces another identity, but that this identity is a new delusion, very likely, that itself needs to be negated, we have to be careful, because this production, this new concept, or this knowledge that is produced from this negation of the negation, it still stands superior to knowledge that has merely gone through a negation. So perhaps this new identity formation, this new dialectical identity formation, is in fact a new delusion. We can still say that this delusion is a delusion of a higher value. It can still have value. What's produced can still have value. And the question is not, is something a delusion because of the process it has gone through? We can't look at it that way. That's a false way to look at it. The question is, what is the nature of the identity that has been produced? What is the nature of the concept that has been produced? The premise that has been produced? The proposition that has been produced? What is the nature of this knowledge, of this identity? We must judge it on the basis of its substance, not on the basis of whether or not it was a negation of a negation that produced an identity, and therefore it must be a delusion. It really doesn't matter, in one sense, how a premise is produced. This is not entirely true, what I just said. It does matter how a premise is produced. But the thing is, if two people are able to arrive at the same premise through different means, it's the power of the premise the power of the concept that matters, the accuracy of the concept that matters, because that's the thing we're trying to get at with the process. And if there's a quicker way to get at the premise without going through a longer process, then we should know what that process is. Adorno says, quoting Hegel, he says, oscillating between the most profound insight and the collapse of that insight is Hegel's line, quote, truth also is positive, as knowledge coinciding with the object, but it is this self-sameness only if knowledge has reacted negatively to the other. If it has penetrated the object and has voided the negation which it is. I read this for one reason. I'm interested by this phrase, voided the negation, voiding a negation. As Hegel talks about this act of voiding this negation, this voidedness, this act of voiding, is placed within a context of value, meaning that one gets something out of voiding the negation, that there is a value in the act of voiding the negation. Now, I'm not exactly sure precisely what this notion of voiding the negation means, unless it means a negation of the negation. Adorno says, the objection that critics of the positive negation of negation violate the vital nerve of Hegel's logic, that they would no longer permit any dialectical motion, shows a faith in authority whereby this motion is limited to Hegel's understanding of himself. The structure of his system would unquestionably fall without the principle that to negate negation is positive. But the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle, but the resistance which otherness offers to identity. My. Adorno is a deep thinker and a difficult thinker. So we have a notion of authority here, whereby this motion is limited to Hegel's understanding of himself. Adorno believes that Hegel's structure of his system would fall without the principle that to negate negation is positive, that the system essentially relies on this notion. And I don't know that Adorno is essentially objecting to this here completely, but what he says after this is quite important. And it's hard to understand, but it is important. He says, but the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle, but the resistance which otherness offers to identity. So I'm drawn in by what he's saying here, because he's saying something that we don't hear a lot in relation to dialectics. He's trying to contextualize and define, let me read it, the empirical substance of dialectics. That catches my attention immediately. The empirical substance of dialectics. Well, this is obviously important because dialectics are abstract. They occupy the conceptual domain. Dialectics are about the movement of the conceptual domain, but that does not mean that they don't have an empirical correspondent or an empirical manifestation in the world. Adorno says, the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle that to negate negation is positive, but the resistance. I'm going to stop it. I'm going to stop the sentence there because this is very important. The empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle that to negate negation is positive. That's not what entails the empirical might of the dialectical force. But dialectics' empirical substance is contained within its resistance. I think we can even take this beyond the text, beyond the context of what Adorno is saying here, because he's exactly right, I believe. So dialectics, in deconstructing the Aristotelian form of logic and going after Aristotle, specifically in the law of identity, Hegel is himself as an object in the world doing this empirically. The object, he is the object in the world, is actually doing this through resistance to the movement and form of Aristotle. Objects colliding within the material world. Specific concepts colliding within the material world. But the power, the force of dialectics, the empirical force, is contained in its resistance, and we can even see it as the dialectician pushes back against the lie of immediacy. We can see it as the dialectician refutes the surface understanding of the object. The surface understanding of the concept, it is an act of resistance. Isn't this interesting that dialectics is not just a logic, but it is an act of resistance. It's a negative logic, but the negativity of dialectics is essentially an activity of thought. Dialectics sets that negativity, it sets that thought in motion, it sets that resistance in motion, it informs it, it empowers it, so that when it does resist, it has the power to overcome the tyranny of identity that always seeks to oppose it, because identity is the static form. It's the lie of static reality. Identity is fluidity. It's movement. And so the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle, but the resistance, which is pushing against the static form of identity. It's the fluidity of thought, the flow of thought, the empirical reality of thought, pushing against the dogmatic and idealist lie that wants to deny the movement of the stream. The empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle, but the resistance which otherness offers to identity. I wonder if Adorno would permit us to say the resistance which difference offers to identity, because that's the opposition that's contained in identity. And so the resistance of dialectics is a difference that opposes the lie of the static form. Otherness offers to identity. Now, it's interesting, offering this resistance to identity. We can take this in the sense of, I don't have the German, so I can't expound this from the actual word, but just thinking about it here from the translation, we can take this notion of otherness offers to identity as meaning a refutation, a confrontation, an opposition to identity, or we can take it in the sense of it trying to help identity move beyond the lie and ideology of itself. Adorno says, hence the power of dialectics. Hence the power of dialectics. I think he has it correct, even though it's easy to miss it in this sentence, that the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle, not the, might even call it the abstract ideal of negation, that to negate negation is positive. It's not that concept, but the resistance which difference offers to identity, hence the power of dialectics, the power to overcome identity, the power to be emancipated from the lie of a static world, to be emancipated from the lie of immediacy as totality. We could say at the more fundamental level that the power of dialectics is really the ability to emancipate the primate from the psychological impulse structure of his conceptual world. I think that's a very, very good way to say it, that at the highest level, the power of dialectics is emancipation, because resistance is resisting to overcome. It's resisting something that is trying to oppress it, that is trying to put it in bondage. It's pushing back against something that is putting pressure on it. And so it's resisting this force, in this sense, an ideological, conceptual lie. And so the power of dialectics is that it can emancipate the individual from the impulse of his psychological thinking. There must be a better way to say this, because I want to get the point across, because it matters a great deal. Power of dialectics is the power to emancipate the primate from his automated psychology, his conceptually automated psychology that doesn't know how to carefully deliberate on the world that it experiences, that it's constantly being deceived by the lie of the appearance of that world. And dialectic comes along and educates and emancipates the primate to be able to interact with that world in a way that the individual is able to peer into the totality of that world, into the diversity of that world, so that the primate can begin to comprehend its complexity. It is a logic that frees the primate from his automation, his automated drive to be deceived by the world and by his own concepts and by his own psychology, that drives him to interpret these concepts in a specific way, that drives him to understand these concepts in an impulsive way where there is no rational mediation process. And dialectics is concerned with the quality of this rational mediation process. It says to the primate, who is merely charging in, to stop. And this is one of the greatest things about dialectic is it resists to stop. And as it stops, to use a rational process of negation to break apart the concrete nuance structure, our semantical structure of reality, so that the primate is no longer charging in, but the primate is entering in to the situation, being led by a knowledge of the object, by a knowledge of the world, and that knowledge helps the primate to orient himself not only to the world, but equally to himself on the basis of a higher rational intelligence. Dialectics are not irrational. This is a complete misunderstanding of what dialectic is. Dialectics are an expansion of rationality. That's what they are. Dialectics does not negate rationality, it expands it. It simply takes the best of critical thinking, of critical thought, of negative thought, and puts it into a more hyper form, puts it into a more careful form, where that form is peering into the presuppositions and the eminent architecture that lies behind things, that things are made out of, that things are structured out of. Dialectics peers into the architecture to understand the architecture, and it's that act of deliberation, that act of critical mediation, that gives the primate the capacity, the power to be emancipated from his impulse and automation that do not want to engage in a process of mediation. The hyper-primate. Dialectic slows the hyper-primate down, the hyper-monkey down, and gets the monkey, the primate, to be able to think and deliberate on what is before him and on his own concepts that he has received through an evolutionary inheritance. Adorno says, the subject too is hidden in dialectics, since its real rule brings forth the contradictions. But the contradictions have filtered into the object. If we attribute dialectics to the subject alone, removing contradiction by contradiction, so to speak, we also remove dialectics by broadening it into a totality. The system was the source of Hegel's dialectics, not its measure. Contradiction, again, functions in dialectics as a positive, as a category that has value instead of a negative category. It's a category that can, in fact, deliver over to us a greater nuanced understanding of the world. It's true that dialectics brings forth contradictions. That's one of the ways as it peers into the world. That's part of its act of seeing through the lie of the world. The lie of the world, the lie of human concepts, are that they try to claim that they don't contain contradiction. They try to present a world that is purely idealistic in terms of black and white identity, and a world in which contradiction is forbidden. So dialectic by its very nature is emancipatory and revolutionary because, as Adorno said, the empirical substance of dialectics is not the principle but resistance, but their resistance to static forms, their resistance to authoritarian forms. And it does this by drawing out, by exposing the ontology of the form, the essence of the form, by manifesting that within the very form that is not conscious of itself is contained a negation of itself. And dialectics is the consciousness, it's the logic that is able to draw this out and then give it back to the concept, to give it back to the ignorance that occupies its own circle without realizing the nature of that circle. Dialectics is the logic that expands knowledge and rationality. It's able to draw out the contradiction from within. If we attribute dialectics to the subject alone, says Adorno, removing contradiction by contradiction, so to speak, we also remove dialectics by broadening it into totality. Yeah, dialectics doesn't remove contradiction by contradiction. It learns that contradiction exists within things. It's part of reality, and that the category, almost miraculously, exists in such a way that it has a positive value to humans, that it helps us to understand the complex nature of reality. And this in itself is hard to understand. The system was the source of Hegel's dialectics, not its measure. Well, I think this is true. I think this is true of everything in the world, but we're not conscious. Systems are not conscious of the fact. Individuals are not conscious of the fact that their logics are drawn from broader systems that make those logics possible. We forget that hierarchies are essentially the result of smaller structures that bring them into positions or states of power. But the system, as the source of dialectics, and perhaps back to my early point that at the beginning, the presupposition at the beginning of thought is dialectical in the sense that it's both positive and it's negative, that because we are a product from a system, we proceed from it, that of course system is the source of dialectics. Of course it is. And this is, if we understand this, I think it expands our understanding of dialectic. It's an advance of dialectic, because to understand that dialectics itself is born of a system matters greatly. It's not just born of an individual. It is the outcome of a very long chain of historical development where consciousness has a conceptual evolution. And that conceptual evolution, though hard to grasp, is still contingent upon and hinges on constructs and concepts that develop within the course of society. And the more that these concepts develops, the more our brains develop, the more capable we are of embodying complexity, comprehending complexity. And I will close with this interesting notion that it's not just that the human brain must expand to the point where it can grasp higher levels of nuance and complexity, but it's also the point that human psychology must do this. This is something I think we don't hear enough of. Hegel seems to understand this in his thinking, because he understands that the failure of dialectics is, in a very real sense, the failure of the human psychology to be able to push back past its uncomfortableness or its psychological pain in peering into reality, in allowing a negation to take place, allowing the thing we love to die so that we can proceed into a deeper, fuller, and richer understanding. And so it's not just the brain that must expand to grasp higher levels of conceptuality of the world, but also the psychological structure. And of course, this is also attached to the brain. It comes from the brain. But it's a necessary component. It's something we never hear about, the expansion of our psychology structure, the ability of it, the necessary capacity. Dialectics presupposes, it demands a certain capacity, ability in human psychology to be able to obtain unto it. Without this capacity to endure pain, without this capacity to push past one-sided formations of reality, or black and white formations of reality, the individual cannot emancipate, cannot proceed into a deeper comprehension of reality, because his idealism, his psychological idealism, or his idealism that's held in place and motivated by his psychology, will not permit him to pass. You shall not pass. It will not allow him to go past the line of his idealism. He will defend his idealism. He will defend his binary thinking. He will defend his black and white view of the world, his one-sided logic, his static logic, because psychologically that's what makes him feel good, that's what makes him feel better. So dialectics are very advanced in terms of a primate's capacity of thought, and they require the expansion of human psychology, of the ability of human psychology to endure ambiguity, to endure psychological pain, in order to grasp a more accurate conceptualization, nuanced understanding of reality.